Hi everybody, I'm Tyler. You guys all probably know me. If you don't, well, that's kind of the purpose of this, is to kind of give you an introduction to me and my taste and where it came from and how it's contributed to who I am. So without further ado, let me get started. I decided I was going to start with this. This is Insides by Orbital. The album is not necessarily my favorite album. It's fantastic, don't get me wrong, but it's important to me because it got me interested in music. Up until this point in my life, I had been listening to what was played on the radio, and I hated it. I became really, really closed-minded to music in general because all I was hearing was the 90s alternative hits. And I started to think that that was pretty much all the music out there. One of my friends actually showed me Kraftwerk, and it led me to make a Pandora station, and I stumbled across Orbital, probably the first artist that I absolutely fell in love with, couldn't get enough of. One of my friends, Alex Niedergerke, I'll give him a shout out in case he ever sees this video, he bought me Orbital's Blue album, and this is the first album that I ever purchased on CD, so has special meaning to me. Next, I wanted to go with Autechre, one of the gods of electronic music. This is Tri Repete. In case you haven't noticed from my posts, I'm deep into electronic music, really explained by the fact that, Orbital, Kraftwerk, those were the first kinds of things I got into. I was really hesitant about this album at first and couldn't really get into it for a long time, but after quite a few listens, suddenly it just clicked and it made sense, and this album has been massively inspirational to me as an artist ever since. It actually took me a long time to find this CD, considering it was printed in the early 90s, and, it's the 2000s, and some of these things have gone out of print now, this being one of them. But I'm glad that I have it. Well, and speaking of the electronic gods, as you might put them, next up is Aphex Twin. This is Selected Ambient Works 85 to 92. Interestingly enough, he lies in interviews a lot, so we're not sure whether to even believe the title. But if 85 to 92 is to be believed, that means some of the tracks on this classic album were written at age 14, which is just astounding to me. It has quite a few sounds of his own invention. He likes to make his own little gadgets and synths, and so you can't really hear this sound anywhere else. Unfortunately, according to him, his cat mangled the master tape, and so the sound quality on the CD, the record pressing, the tape, everything is just very poor. But I honestly think it's just meant as kind of a ploy to give it a different kind of a sound, a deteriorated sound. It's absolutely gorgeous. There are songs on here that are really active and songs on here that'll just completely relax you. If you haven't heard it, you need to. It's considered a masterpiece among electronic music. Next up is Dead Cities by the Future Sound of London. This album actually isn't my favorite Future Sound of London album, although it's definitely close. But the reason that I picked this album is because it taught me the value of the album as a musical unit. It flows so well, and it really tells a story. If you listen to it all at once, you can totally hear the theme of the urban decay. It's another electronic album that it has both its quiet moments and its louder moments, but altogether you can definitely see what brings it together as one unified package. Next up is another album I was actually really against for a while. This is Hard Normal Daddy by Square Pusher. Squarepusher is one of the founding members alongside Aphex Twin of the drum and bass genre. And this album definitely exemplifies that. It's kind of a weird fusion between jazz and acid funk and electronic music and drum and bass. And so it kind of goes all over the place. But you can definitely hear the sound that he's going for, and it works so well. There's not a single bad song on this album. It was massively influential in its time for establishing such a strong fusion that didn't really exist before, and it remains one of my favorite albums. While we're on the subject of drum and bass, I have to bring up my favorite drum and bass album, and I'm going to totally botch the pronunciation because I'm not Hungarian. This is Rosszalag alatt Született by Venetian Snares. Interestingly enough, he's not Hungarian either. He's Canadian. I guess he just decided he wanted to really screw with everybody's pronunciation skills. All the song titles are also in that language. This is a really, really cool combination of orchestral classical sounds and drum and bass. It manages to be both beautiful and punishing at the same time. And again, not a single bad song on it. I've visited this countless times, and I've heard other drum and bass albums, and nothing even really comes close to pushing this one out of my #1 spot. It just is amazing in the drum and bass field. Going a little bit outside of the realm of electronic music for a minute, and into jazz, I'm going to pull out my favorite jazz album. That would be Giant Steps by John Coltrane, although it's closely rivaled by John Coltrane's other, A Love Supreme. John Coltrane is a saxophone player. This was released in 1959, which was just a huge breakthrough year for jazz, and it's just really, really amazing. His skills shine like no other. It's a must-have for anybody who even remotely likes jazz. I'm pretty new to the genre, so any of my jazz picks are pretty common, but definitely worth more than one listen. But even if you don't like jazz, you ought to give this one a try. You never know. Another one of my favorite jazz albums is the one that got me into jazz, willing to try it. It was recommended to me by my jazz history professor when I took the class last semester up here at the university. And it's the obvious Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. In this album, it's very slow. It's modal jazz, so it's not really meant to be high-paced or really active, but it rewards both close listening and just sitting back and relaxing to it. According to him, he's never met anybody who hasn't liked it, and I haven't seen it proved wrong yet. So, again, even if you don't think you like jazz, you'll probably like this one. There's just not a way to dislike it. Give it a shot. Like I said earlier, I was really close-minded to other genres of music for a long time. I only listened to electronic music. I got really deep into it, which is awesome. It's still my home-based genre. But second after that is the mysterious genre that can't really be classified with a really obnoxious umbrella called indie rock. I have to thank Grizzly Bear for getting me into that. This is Vecatimus by Grizzly Bear. It's a fire for what? Time for fair. It's not everybody's favorite. In fact, I don't know if I've ever met anybody else who it's their favorite indie rock album, but it certainly is mine. Partially because it has the personal meaning of getting me to broaden my horizons and look into other genres of music. Both Daniel Rawson and Ed Droste's voice on this are just godly sounding. There's not a single bad song on this one either. I have listened to it countless times and never get tired of it. If I had to pick an album, uh, a rock album that I wanted to keep, and that would be the only one I could keep, this might be it. Um, it just is phenomenal. The songs are both catchy and interesting, and it's also somewhat experimental, but not so far out there that it's going to drive anybody off. There's some great acoustic songs as well as some that just have a little bit more of a beat to them. So, again, just one of my all-time favorites. Since I'm bringing up Grizzly Bear, I also have to say that this one, Shields, is phenomenal. Grizzly Bear's my favorite indie rock band, so I could really say that about any of their albums. Yellow House was also a contender for this video. But this album, even though it's relatively new, pushes in a more unified sound to the band. All of the members are starting to collaborate in the songwriting a lot more, and it just shows huge talent as musicians. I actually got to see them perform this in concert, which was amazing, except that it was a Twilight Series concert, so the crowd was less than pleasant, we could say. I'm sure Chris and Greg will back me up on that. But this album, I've listened to it 1,000 times, I'm sure, and still love every song on it. And some of them are really, really relatable to me. So just absolutely fantastic. It does push in a lot more of a in-your-face kind of a sound than their previous albums, which were more acoustic. The contender for some of my favorite indie rock albums, The Suburbs by Arcade Fire. In my dream, I was almost there, then you pulled me aside and said you're going nowhere. They say we are the chosen few, but we wasted, and that's why we're still waiting. Most of you, if not all of you, have heard this. It won several awards, perhaps one of the only albums that I love that's ever won at the Grammys. But there's a reason. It's just amazing. The songs are really relatable. They're very nostalgic. The music is both laid back and straightforward at the same time. It's just got catchy hooks, and it's also just a pleasant listen, but, not mindless either by any means. This really, really shows why Arcade Fire is getting so much attention and what makes them worthwhile. If you haven't heard this, then you're really missing out. You need to give it a shot. Next, I want to talk about probably my saddest album in my collection, and I desperately hope I can find this on vinyl at some point, probably at the top of my wish list, but this is Untitled by Sigur Rós, also known as Parentheses to some fans. Really cool cover, and that kind of bleak minimalist look fits the sound really well. This is probably the saddest album I've ever heard. It's very hopeless sounding, very lost, and anytime that I'm in a bad mood, this is definitely the first thing that I go to play. It's so fragile and delicate and gorgeous and very, very passionate. And even though there are no English words on it, it still manages to pull at your heartstrings. So, I mean, everybody has felt what this album portrays. In fact, somebody once told me that the purpose of music is to express the human condition. The big question that music attempts to answer is, what is it like to be human? And I have to say, this album answers it pretty well. Also on my emotional list goes another one of my all-time favorite albums, although not very many people have heard of it. This is The Devil's Walk by Apparat.
There was a dawn on my sparkling rays were pouring in.
Some of the songs are synth pop kind of sounding, and some of them are just really beautiful and mellow. Um, it's another electronic album, but the singer Sasha Ring has a just godly voice. Absolutely adore listening to it. This is another one I've heard countless times, and fell in love with it the second that I heard it, and I've never changed my opinion of it. I know this isn't as much of a common one, so when you get done with this video, I hope you'll go give it a shot because you won't regret it at all, especially if you're an electronic fan. Also along the lines of emotional electronic, it's pretty predictable. I didn't steal Chris's idea, but Vespertine by Bjork. Possibly the most intimate album ever recorded. It's really personal. It feels like reading directly from Bjork's diary. I almost feel invasive just listening to it. But you can hear the longing and the passion and the emotion in her voice and in the songwriting and in the sounds and synths that she uses. From start to finish, you feel like you're peeking right into her head. And an album that personal can't be left off of anybody's list of best albums. Even if you're not a Bjork fan, you ought to at least listen to this once because it might change your mind. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous album. Next up, I know I'm going to catch some flack for this because several of you aren't fans. Seems like you either love them or hate them. There is no in between. But I have to bring it up because I absolutely love it. High Violet by The National.
It's a Hollywood summer. You never believe the shitty thoughts I think.
This album is it's not their most recent album, and it's actually not even their most popular. I would probably say Boxer is their most popular, but this album is definitely my favorite. I love every song on it. I've gone back to it tons of times since I've heard it, and even though their lyrics don't always make sense, and most of them are pretty depressing lyrics, the songwriting's amazing. Matt Berninger's voice is very, very wonderful, and the production value is just very well done. I believe Aaron Dessner is the producer on these, and this is just grade A indie rock. You can't get much better than this, honestly. If you're not a fan of The National, I'm not mad at you. I honestly pity you. You're missing out, really. Next up is OK Computer by Radiohead. This album is definitely a favorite among both fans and non-fans. It hits a perfect balance between their alternative rock kinds of sounds, like from albums such as The Bends, and their more experimental sound that would come later with Kid A, Amnesiac, etc. This album is it's just a win-win for everybody. It's got some songs that are a little bit heavier on the rock side, as well as some that dabble a little bit more in electronics. All of them are pretty catchy, and yet all of them really will reward close listening. I don't know if much needs to be said about this because most of you have already heard it, but for the non-Radiohead fans, don't give up on this album yet. There's something in it for everybody. Up next is my favorite Death Cab album. It's actually not most people's favorites, but I absolutely adore it. Narrow Stairs by Death Cab for Cutie.
Now it's in the alley behind your apartment with a sign that says it's free.
I actually bought this when I was kind of in my pretentious hipster kind of a stage, and I thought, Death Cab is too big of a name. It probably isn't really that good if everybody likes it, which is a flawed mentality. I'm so glad I got over that. But It was $3.99 and I got $1 off. $3, how bad can it be? It wasn't bad at all. Some of the best $3 I've ever spent. It's definitely my favorite Death Cab for Cutie album. Strikes a nice balance between the rock sounds and the somewhat experimental sounds. All right, we're getting into some of my absolute favorites now. This one is actually my favorite Orbital album, although it and Insides are really, really difficult to choose between. This is Snivelization.
While millions of pigeons hover and go hungry, again forever,
This is actually a political statement against Britain's suppression of raves and dance music. There were actually a lot of artists in electronic music that did this at the time. Autechre was another one. There's kind of a cool story behind that, but I can save it for another day. But this album flows really, really well, and it kind of steps out of house and rave music territory and into more serious electronic, which is something that I really, really love about it. And I've always been a huge fan of the cover art. Not entirely sure why. It's kind of intriguing. But definitely worth a listen for any electronic or house fan. And of course, I'm sure that almost everybody watching this that knows me was waiting for me to say it. One of, if not my favorite album, Music Has the Right to Children by Boards of Canada. Revolutionary to home listening electronica, as it's sometimes called, or IDM. There's all sorts of names for it. This album was experimental, but also really, really accessible. It's got a really nostalgic, deteriorated feel to it, which is really, really cool. One of my prized possessions, both as a vinyl and just in general. This and, well, I don't know, this competes definitely for my favorite album of all time, really, really strongly. You know that if you know me, because I talk about it a lot. I really like the album art. The faces missing kind of give it a mysterious feel. Every song on it's good. They have a lot of vignettes on here, which makes for an interesting feel, but the flow of the album is just pristine. They do not miss a beat with this. If there's any electronic album I would recommend to anybody, it would probably be this one. It's just a must listen to. This album, this is Double Figure by Plaid. It's got a lot of catchy tunes on it, but also a lot of more serious things too. It's another electronic album from Warp Records. The gods of electronic music all come from there. That's just the record label to go to. It's another one that flows really well. The album works together as a cohesive whole in so many ways. All the songs on it are great. I've seen them used even in video games now. But I strongly recommend this. One of my favorite electronic groups for sure. They have a new album coming out here in 2014, so I'm excited for that to come up. This one's another one that I really don't think that you can go wrong with it. It's got something there to offer everybody, even if you're not huge into electronic music. This is A Strangely Isolated Place by Ulrich Schnauz. It's sadly really overlooked because people kind of assume that it's just too, I don't know, free-floating, I guess. It's not super technical. It's nothing innovative. It's nothing new. but it's kind of a cool balance between electronic and shoegaze. It's got some really, really neat sounds in here, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful album. I've never met anybody who doesn't like at least one song off of here, and most people I've ever showed just love this album. And for anybody who passes this off because it's not serious enough or there's not enough IDM or whatever, it's truly their loss, because this is just a pleasant listen for any occasion. This is another one of my favorites, although not very many people have even heard of it. This is Immolate Yourself by Telephone Tel Aviv. It's a synth pop album, and it's actually fairly dark, even though it doesn't necessarily sound like it. One of the most emotional albums I have, and what makes it even more emotional is to know that between the US and European releases, one of the two members of the band passed away from accidental mixture of alcohol and sleeping pills. So the band met its demise that way, kind of at a peak. All of their albums sound extremely different. The first one's like an after club, chill techno kind of a thing. The second one is an emotional IDM electronic, and this is a synth pop. There's only one bothersome song on here, which is overlookable. It's a shame that there's even one dent, but overall, this is one of my all-time favorite albums. I was overjoyed when I got it. I can't get enough of it. And I'll recommend it in a heartbeat to anybody who hasn't heard it. So there you have it. Another electronic album. This is I Care Because You Do by Aphex Twin. It's kind of interesting how the album is laid out. It has this kind of an arc to it. There's an introduction, a development, and then an exposition, just like you might have in a classical piece. The first few songs start off somewhat quiet, but with tension. And there's a lot of melodies, keyboards in it. Again, he invents his own synths, so there are some unique sounds on here you won't find anywhere else. And then it gets into really, really rough territory. This has one of the harshest singles ever recorded on it. It's called Ventolin. And I can only take it once in a blue moon because it's literally painful. He made it as it's supposed to be kind of an audible representation of an asthma attack. And so there's this high-pitched squealing in it the entire time. And then after that, it calms down and pumps out some of the most amazing and pulchritudinous tunes I have ever heard. Songs like Alberto Balsam make it on my favorites lists every time I make one. It really is a beautiful album if you're willing to give it a shot, but beautiful in kind of a twisted sort of way. And it definitely has some rough spots to get through, not necessarily because they're bad, but because to the listener who doesn't expect it, it definitely hammers some of those sounds into your head. Another easy to expect one is Kid A by Radiohead. One of the landmarks in recent music. This album just broke all sorts of ground, crossing rock over into electronic in a whole new kind of way. This was exciting to me to find because I'd heard the name Radiohead a lot, but I assumed it was that alternative rock that for a long time I was closed to listening to. But I found out this was an electronic album, and I was a little bit confused. This is a rock album, but it draws so much influence from Aphex Twin and Autechre so as to be classified as electronic in a way. And you can definitely hear the influence throughout. And this portrays some of my favorite sounds, some of the things I look for most in music. Interestingly enough, this album art presents strong similarities to an Autechre album that is actually my favorite Autechre album. I'm about to show it. You'll notice this has the mountains, the darker look, somewhat unsettling, but also somewhat picturesque at the same time. Like I said, this electronic sound is both innovative and familiar, especially to an electronic listener like me. And it's just mind-blowing every time. Here's the Autechre album as promised. Autechre, Amber. This album is one of Autechre's earlier albums, and it's not quite so experimental as their later stuff. This is the album that really, really caused me to fall in love with them and admire them so much. If I could make an album like this, I could die happy. All the songs on here are both very technical, but at the same time so warm and inviting. They are kind of dark. You can see the lighting on the cover. Let me put it closer to the camera. You can see the lighting on the cover almost looks like we're in a sunset here. And it's extremely fitting because that's kind of how the album sounds. A lot of times we'll hear electronic sounds overlaid by these shining, glimmering synths, and it just kind of fades out really blissfully. The album is just gorgeous. And every time I listen to it, I realize I had forgotten just how great it is. So if you haven't heard this, it's another one. You just have to try it. You have to see why I'm so enthusiastic about it. It's really, really a staple of what electronic music is all about and what I always look for in new electronic albums. There's not very much out there like this. And here we have Giugotti by Boards of Canada. This is another one of my all-time favorites alongside those last 3 or 4 that I showed. This album, this is a triple LP, which is really awesome. The cover art features just a lot of really unique kaleidoscope images. And it's extremely dark. One of the darkest albums in my library, actually. It takes you into some creepy places. It features a lot of backmasking and a lot of subliminal messaging. It talks about mythology, dark mythology, of course, about religious sects, about hypnotism. All these are addressed within, and not necessarily by words, because Boards of Canada doesn't use lyrics in their songs, but more by the sounds. It's really, really gorgeous, don't get me wrong. It has some really serene sounds, but it's disturbing in a unique sort of way. And you know that I can't stop talking up Boards of Canada, and I never will be able to. So all that really needs to be said is it's Boards of Canada. It's perfect. Thanks for watching. I hope that the video's kind of enlightened you on some music, maybe something you haven't heard before and are interested in going to check out. If you want any recommendations, if you like what I had to say about something or enjoyed one of the albums, please feel free to let me know if you had any questions at all. Look forward to seeing anybody else's video or hearing about your tastes or what you think of mine. Thanks again for watching.